My name is Harold Sandin, and I've been a quiet man for most of my life. That wasn't always by choice. Some silences are taught, others are enforced. The rest are earned through fear. I served as a forest ranger in 1968, stationed deep in a stretch of protected land most folks only knew as a green blur on a folded paper map. No landmarks worth remembering, no tourist lodges, no scenic overlooks with postcards nailed to corkboards, just timber, fog, and miles of ground that didn't care whether you understood it or not. What I'm about to tell you was never written into an incident report. It never made it into a logbook, and it sure as hell never went up the chain the way it should have. I carried it instead, through marriages, through retirement, through decades of waking up at 3:17 in the morning with the same smell in my nose, wet soil and something older underneath it. Back then we still trusted paper, paper maps, paper forms, carbon copies. You wrote things down, you signed your name, and that meant something. Or at least it was supposed to. The report I never filed started on an ordinary patrol. It was late September, the kind of morning where the fog doesn't lift so much as thin out, like the forest is deciding how much of itself it wants to show you. I remember checking my truck, an old green service pickup with a cracked vinyl seat, and signing out an analog radio from the station locker. The antenna was bent from a fall years earlier. It only worked if you held it just right. Routine patrol, that's what the log said. But there was nothing routine about the map. I noticed it about 2 hours in. I'd pulled over near a fire road to double-check my position, unfolded the map across the hood of the truck, and realized the tree line ahead didn't match the markings. According to the map, there was supposed to be a boundary sign about 50 yards in. Yellow paint, clear lettering. There was nothing. No sign, no marker, no warning. Just trees too close together, trunks dark with moisture, branches knitted so tightly overhead that the daylight thinned into something gray and tired. I remember thinking it was a printing error. Maps back then weren't perfect. But the longer I stood there, the more unsettled I felt. Not fear exactly. More like the sensation you get when you realize a room has gone quiet and you don't remember the conversation stopping. I keyed the radio. "Station, this is Ranger Sandin. I'm near the North Fire Road off mile marker 12. Boundary signage appears to be missing. Over." Static answered first, then a voice faint delayed. "Copy Sandin, stand by." I waited. The radio crackled, hissed, then went dead. That should have been my cue to turn around. Instead, I drove forward. The road narrowed almost immediately, tires crunching over gravel that looked freshly disturbed. No weeds pushing through. No animal tracks, like the ground had been turned over and smoothed out by something careful. The trees pressed closer. The air felt heavier, damp in a way that didn't match the weather report. I shut off the engine and stepped out, the forest swallowing the sound like it had been waiting for it. That was when I noticed the quiet. No birds, no insects, not even wind. I'd worked these woods long enough to know silence didn't mean peace. It meant absence. It meant something had cleared the area without leaving tracks. I wrote the time in my pocket notebook, 10:42 a.m. A habit, one that would later work against me. I walked maybe 100 yards in, boots sinking slightly with each step, and found something that still visits me in dreams. A clearing unnatural in its shape, too round, too precise. The ground was bare earth, darker than the surrounding soil, and in the center of it was a depression. Not a hole, not exactly. More like the earth had settled around something that was no longer there. I circled it slowly, heart thudding in my ears. There were marks along the edge, long, shallow grooves radiating outward, as if something had been dragged or pulled free. I remember kneeling, pressing my fingers into the dirt. It was warm. That's when the radio screamed to life. Not static, not interference. A voice. "Don't log this." It cut out immediately. I stared at the radio in my hand, my reflection warped in the scratched plastic casing. I hadn't given my position. I hadn't described what I'd found. And yet, the message was clear enough to raise the hair on my arms. Don't log this. I should have turned around then. Should have closed the map, driven back to the station, and pretended I never crossed that invisible line. But rangers are trained to observe, to document, to follow through. And I had no idea yet that this wasn't a missing sign or a mapping error. It was a boundary that wasn't meant to be acknowledged. As I stood there alone in that clearing, I felt something shift, not in the forest but in myself, a sense that I'd stepped into a story already in progress, one with rules I hadn't been told and consequences I wouldn't understand until much later. I wrote one more thing in my notebook before leaving the clearing. Soil disturbance, cause unknown. That line would be the last honest thing I ever put on record. Because by the end of that day, I would understand why some things stay buried, not because they're dead, but because they're waiting. I didn't return to the station right away. That's another decision that still weighs on me. I told myself I was doing my job, verifying boundaries, checking for illegal activity, making sure no one had wandered somewhere they shouldn't. But the truth is simpler and uglier. I was curious. Curiosity has killed more than cats out there. It's killed good rangers, too. I walked the perimeter of the clearing until my legs began to ache, keeping my back straight, my breathing measured. Training kicks in when your instincts don't know what to do. You focus on procedure. You note distances. You mark trees with chalk. Anything to keep your mind from filling the silence with questions. The forest still hadn't come back to life. No birds, no wind. Even my footsteps sounded wrong, muted, as if the ground was listening. I checked my watch. 11:18 a.m. Time felt thicker in that place, like it didn't want to move unless pushed. I keyed the radio again. Station, this is Sandon. I'm requesting confirmation of boundary coordinates north of Fire Road 12. Over. Static longer this time. Then a voice I didn't recognize. Ranger Sandon, return to your vehicle. Not a request, no call sign, no acknowledgement. Copy, I said, though my throat was dry. Who's this? The radio went dead. I stood there for a long moment, the weight of the trees pressing in, and realized something that sent a cold line of understanding through me. The voice hadn't come from the station. The delay was wrong. The tone too close, like the speaker had been standing just beyond the tree line. I walked back to the truck faster than I meant to, boots slipping slightly in the soft earth. When I reached it, I noticed the first real sign that I wasn't alone. Another set of footprints. They were mine, but not entirely. Same boot pattern, same size, but the stride was off, longer than mine, and they overlapped in places they shouldn't have. As if someone had followed my path a few minutes behind, stepping where I stepped, but leaning more weight into the ground. I didn't check where they led. I got in the truck, shut the door, and locked it, even though there was no reason to. My hands shook when I turned the key. The engine coughed, then roared to life, loud enough to feel like a challenge to the forest. As I drove back down the narrowing road, the radio crackled again. This time it was a name. Miller. Ranger Thomas Miller had gone missing 3 years earlier. Officially, it was ruled an accident, solo patrol, Rough terrain. No body recovered. We held a service, folded a flag, and reassigned his sector. No one talked about the fact that his last reported position was near the same fire road. "No," I said aloud, my voice sounding small in the cab. "That's not possible." The radio didn't respond, but the sense of being followed didn't leave. When I reached the station, the world felt wrong in a different way. Too loud, phones ringing, doors slamming, the smell of burnt coffee and cigarette smoke hanging in the air. I wanted to grab the duty officer and tell him everything, to spill it out while it was still fresh, before doubt had time to settle in. Instead, I was told to report to the supervisor's office. He didn't ask me to sit. He closed the door, drew the blinds, and placed my pocket notebook on the desk between us. I hadn't handed it over. I was sure of that. "You crossed into a restricted sector today," he said, voice calm, almost bored. "There was no signage," I replied. "No indication on the map." "That's because it doesn't exist," he said. "Not officially." I stared at him. "Then why is it restricted?" He leaned back in his chair, studying me the way you study a structural crack, deciding whether it's cosmetic or something that'll bring the whole building down. "Some areas are set aside for reasons beyond our pay grade," he said. "Your job is to stay where you're told." "What about the clearing?" I asked. "The soil disturbance, the radio transmission. Someone used Miller's name." His jaw tightened just slightly, enough to notice. "You didn't hear anything," he said, "and you didn't see anything worth writing down." I glanced at my notebook. It was open to the page I'd written in the clearing. The words "soil disturbance," "cause unknown," were crossed out in red pencil, hard enough to tear the paper. "You'll amend your log," he continued. "Routine patrol, no anomalies, radio interference due to terrain." "And Miller," I asked, "if there's even a chance." "There isn't," he cut in. "Miller is dead, and whatever you th. Ink you heard was your mind filling in gaps." He slid a form across the desk. Amendment paperwork, already filled out, just waiting for my signature. That was the moment I understood the rules. Not the written ones, the real ones. You could stumble onto something out there, something old, something wrong, and as long as it stayed unspoken, you'd be allowed to keep breathing. But the second you tried to drag it into the light, it would be taken from you. Your job, your credibility, maybe more. I signed the form. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that I went home, poured a drink, and let time smooth the edges off the memory. But that night, lying in my bunk at the ranger housing, I heard something outside. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, matching mine. They stopped just outside my window. And then, very softly, someone spoke my name in a voice that sounded like it had learned it by listening for a long, long time. I didn't sleep that night. The footsteps outside my window never moved closer, never moved away. They just stayed there like a reminder, like punctuation at the end of a sentence I hadn't finished reading yet. When morning came, the forest sounded normal again. Birds, wind, life returning as if on cue. That more than anything scared me. Whatever had been listening knew when to stop. I reported for duty at 600. No one mentioned the night. No one asked why my eyes were bloodshot or why I flinched when the radio crackled. The supervisor handed me a reassigned patrol route, south sector this time, far from the fire road, far from the clearing. I followed orders. For weeks. But the forest has a way of circling back to what's been disturbed. It started with missing time. I'd check my watch at one marker, hike a familiar stretch, and arrive at the next checkpoint 40 minutes late with no memory of the walk between. My boots would be caked with that same dark soil, warm to the touch even in cold weather. Then came the reports, unofficial ones. Campers hearing voices that used their names. Hunters finding game skinned and arranged with surgical precision. A seasonal ranger refusing to go back out after claiming the trees had leaned in while he slept. Each time the paperwork vanished. Each time the explanation was mundane, stress, imagination, poor lighting. Until the recovery. Late October, early snow. A call came in about equipment found near the restricted sector. No body, just gear, a canteen, a radio, a badge. Miller's badge. They sent a small team. I wasn't supposed to be on it. Somehow my name was added anyway. The clearing was different when we reached it. Smaller, as if the forest had tightened around it. The depression in the center was gone, replaced by a mound of freshly turned earth. Breathing earth. I know how that sounds. I also know what I saw. The soil rose and fell, slow and patient. One of the men knelt, pressed a hand to the ground, and went pale. He started to say something, then stopped, just stared, listening. We never dug. Orders came through the radio mid-breath, sharp and immediate. Secure the items. Mark the coordinates as unstable terrain. Leave. As we turned back, I heard it clearly this time. Not from the radio, not from the trees. From below us. A voice trying to remember how to be human. Harold. That was the day I understood what we'd buried wasn't a body. It was a boundary. Something ancient had been interrupted decades earlier, cut, mapped, named, and sealed with paperwork and silence. The forest wasn't haunted. It was containing something. And containment only works if no one acknowledges what's inside. I resigned the following spring. No ceremony, no farewell, just a handshake and a look that said I was smart to leave things alone. I moved away, started a family, built a life that looked ordinary from the outside. But the forest never really let me go. Every few years I'd hear about a missing hiker, a ranger who transferred suddenly, a section of land quietly closed for maintenance. Different states, same patterns. Always trees. Always silence. Now I'm an old man. My hands shake when I write this. Not from age, from knowing that by putting these words down, I'm doing the one thing I was warned never to do. Logging it. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm telling this because the boundary is weakening. You can feel it if you know what to listen for. The forest doesn't want to hold it anymore. If you ever find yourself on a trail that isn't on the map, if the radio answers before you speak, if the ground feels warm when it shouldn't, turn back. And if someone tells you not to log it, understand that they're not protecting you. They're protecting what's still buried.